The night was already heavy with tension when the military ambulance stopped in front of the hospital. Red lights flashed against the glass doors, and the sound of rushed footsteps filled the hallway. Inside the ambulance lay a Navy SEAL commander, badly injured during a dangerous mission overseas. His uniform was cut open, his body covered in blood and dust from the battlefield. He had survived situations most people could not imagine, but now his life depended on what would happen in the next few hours. Doctors and medical staff moved fast. This was not an ordinary patient. A SEAL commander meant experience, leadership, and someone who had led men through life-and-death situations. The hospital had been warned in advance, so the best trauma doctors were already waiting. Machines were prepared, tools laid out, and everyone knew there was no room for mistakes. Every second mattered. As the doors to the emergency room opened, the commander was rushed inside on a stretcher. His breathing was weak, and his face showed pain, even though he tried to stay strong. The doctors immediately started giving orders. One checked his pulse, another examined his wounds, while others prepared for surgery. The room was filled with serious voices and quick movements. No one was relaxed. This was a fight to keep a hero alive. Standing quietly near the wall was a woman in a simple nurse's uniform. Her badge showed she was newly assigned to the hospital. She didn't speak loudly or try to attract attention. She just watched. Her eyes followed every movement, every decision being made. To anyone else in the room, she looked like a beginner, someone still learning the system. In a place full of senior doctors and experienced surgeons, she seemed small and unimportant. Some of the doctors noticed her and exchanged quick looks. A few thought it was strange to have a new nurse present during such a serious case. One doctor quietly joked that this was not the right place for training. Another smiled and shook his head, clearly thinking she would only get in the way. They didn't mean harm, but they didn't take her seriously either. The nurse did not react. She did not argue or look offended. Her face stayed calm, almost unreadable. She stood straight, her hands steady, as if she had been in situations like this before. While others focused on the obvious injuries, she carefully observed the commander's breathing, his skin color, and the small details that many missed in the rush. The commander let out a low groan as pain moved through his body. For a moment, his eyes opened slightly, unfocused and tired. The nurse noticed this. She stepped a little closer, not to interfere, but to understand his condition better. She recognized the look of a soldier who had pushed his body too far and was now paying the price. Outside the room, the hospital was quiet, but inside, it felt like a battlefield of its own. The doctors worked hard, speaking in medical terms, calling for scans and blood tests. They believed they were in full control. None of them imagined that someone they had already dismissed might soon change everything. The nurse continued to watch, silent and patient. She did not need to prove herself yet. She knew that moments like these had a way of revealing the truth. Sometimes the loudest voices were not the most experienced ones. Sometimes, real skill showed itself only when things started to go wrong. As the doctors prepared to move the commander for further treatment, the nurse took a slow breath. Something about the situation did not feel right to her. She couldn't explain it yet, but her instincts were awake. Years of experience no one in that room knew about, were quietly warning her. For now, she remained in the background, just another new nurse in the eyes of the doctors. But the night was only beginning, and what was about to happen would soon force everyone in that room to see her very differently. As the treatment continued, the mood inside the emergency room slowly changed. The first rush of action was over, and now the doctors believed they had control of the situation. They spoke with confidence, giving instructions and checking screens. In their minds, this was a difficult case, but still one they could handle. The presence of the new nurse near the wall seemed even more unnecessary to them now. The nurse watched closely as the doctors discussed the commander's injuries. She noticed small details that didn't match what they were saying. His breathing pattern was uneven, not in a normal way for the wounds he had. His skin felt cooler than it should, and the color around his lips was slightly wrong. These were quiet warning signs. She had seen them before in places far more dangerous than this hospital room. Carefully, she spoke up. Her voice was calm and respectful. She suggested that the injury might be more complicated than it looked and that there could be a hidden problem inside his body. She did not raise her voice or challenge anyone directly. She simply shared what she observed, hoping they would listen. The room went quiet for a second. Then one of the doctors smiled in a way that was not kind. Another let out a short laugh. A senior doctor looked at her and said she should focus on basic tasks and let the professionals handle the decisions. Someone muttered that this was not a classroom. The words were not shouted, but they were sharp enough to hurt. A few people in the room chuckled softly. To them, it was almost amusing that a new nurse thought she could guide a team of experienced doctors. They had spent years in medical school and hospitals. What could she possibly know that they didn't? The nurse felt the weight of their doubt, but she did not show it. She did not argue back or explain herself. Instead, she nodded slightly and stepped back. On the outside, she looked obedient. On the inside, she was focused. She had learned long ago that ego could be dangerous, especially in life and death situations. As the doctors continued, they focused on treating what they believed were the main injuries. Machines beeped steadily, showing numbers that seemed acceptable for now. The doctors relaxed just a little. One even made a quiet comment about how lucky the commander was to have reached the hospital in time. The nurse kept watching the screens. She noticed tiny changes that others ignored. The heart rate was not stable. The oxygen level dipped for a moment, then came back up. These were signs of something deeper. She remembered wounded soldiers from the battlefield, men who looked stable until they suddenly collapsed because the real problem had been missed. She took another step forward and gently tried again. She suggested checking for a specific internal issue that could explain the strange signs. This time, the reaction was colder. The lead doctor frowned and told her firmly that she was distracting the team. He reminded her of her position and told her to stay back unless spoken to. The message was clear. She was not welcome to share her thoughts. The nurse stepped away once more. Her hands remained steady, but her eyes stayed locked on the commander. She felt frustration, but she controlled it. She knew that arguing would only make things worse. In the past, she had seen lives lost because people refused to listen. She prayed this would not be another one of those moments. Across the room, the commander let out a sudden sharp breath. For a brief moment, his face tightened with pain. The nurse noticed immediately. She moved closer to the bed, checking his expression and posture. One of the doctors waved her away, telling her everything was fine. But she knew it wasn't. The laughter and dismissive smiles from earlier still hung in the air. The doctors believed they were in charge, and that belief made them blind. To them, the nurse was just a background figure, someone meant to follow orders, not give them. The nurse took a deep breath and waited. She had a strong feeling that time was running out. She hoped she was wrong. But deep inside, she feared that the moment they were all ignoring was about to become impossible to ignore. And when that moment came, there would be no more laughter. The room was still busy, but something felt wrong. The machines continued to beep, yet their sounds were no longer steady and calm. The Navy SEAL commander's breathing became heavier, as if each breath required more effort than the last. His chest rose unevenly, and a light sweat formed on his forehead. To most of the doctors, these changes did not seem serious yet. They believed it was a normal reaction to pain and trauma. But the nurse noticed the difference immediately. She stepped closer again, her eyes moving from the commander's face to the monitors and then back to his body. His skin had turned slightly pale, and his hands were colder than before. These were not small things. These were signs that something inside his body was failing. She had seen this before in wounded soldiers who looked stable just minutes before collapsing. The doctors were discussing test results and planning the next steps. They spoke confidently, using medical terms and long explanations. They were focused on what they could see: external wounds, broken bones, and blood loss that had already been treated. They believed the danger was under control. The nurse quietly listened, but in her mind, alarms were ringing. She realized that the commander's symptoms did not match the injuries the doctors were treating. His body was reacting as if there was hidden damage. Something was wrong deep inside, something that scans and quick checks might not easily show. It reminded her of battlefield injuries where soldiers were hit in a way that caused internal pressure and delayed reactions. She remembered moments from the past, dust-filled tents, wounded men brought in under fire, and the terrible silence that followed when a hidden injury was discovered too late. Those memories sharpened her focus. She could not ignore what she was seeing. Carefully, she approached the lead doctor again. This time, her voice was more serious, though still respectful. She explained that the commander's condition did not fit the current diagnosis. She pointed out the changes in breathing, temperature, and skin color. She suggested that they might be dealing with an internal complication caused by the way the commander had been injured or treated in the field. The doctor barely looked at her. He waved his hand slightly and told her they had already considered all possibilities. He said the tests were clear and that she was worrying too much. Another doctor added that trauma cases often looked worse before they got better. To them, her concern was unnecessary noise. A quiet tension filled the room. The nurse stepped back again, but her eyes never left the commander. She felt a deep sense of unease. Every minute that passed increased the risk. She knew that if her suspicion was correct, waiting could be deadly. Suddenly, the commander's heart rate spiked. The monitor made a sharp sound that caught everyone's attention. A doctor moved quickly to adjust medication, believing it was a simple response to pain. For a moment, the numbers improved, and the room relaxed again. But the nurse knew this was not a solution. It was only hiding the real problem. She watched the commander's face. His jaw tightened, and his breath became shallow. His body was fighting something the doctors had not yet seen. She noticed slight swelling in an area that had not been injured before. It was subtle, but to her it was clear. This was the missing piece. She took a step forward, her heart pounding. She tried one more time, pointing directly at the signs everyone else had missed. She explained how this kind of injury could fool even advanced equipment and how it required immediate attention. The reaction was sharp and final. The lead doctor turned to her with clear irritation. He told her firmly that she was out of line. He reminded her again that she was a nurse, not a surgeon, and ordered her to step away from the patient. The room went quiet. No one supported her. No one questioned the decision. The nurse obeyed. She stepped back, her face calm, but inside she felt fear. Not for herself, but for the man lying on the bed. The commander suddenly gasped. His body tensed, and the monitors began to beep faster. This time, it was not something that could be ignored. The doctors rushed back to the bed, their confidence shaken. The nurse stood still, watching. She knew the moment she had feared had arrived. The problem was no longer hidden, and now there was very little time left. The sudden change in the commander's condition shocked everyone in the room. The steady beeping of the machines turned fast and loud. Red warning lights flashed on the monitors. The man who only minutes ago seemed stable was now fighting to stay alive. Doctors rushed toward the bed, calling out orders and adjusting equipment. The confidence they had earlier was gone. This was no longer a routine emergency. This was a crisis. The commander's breathing became shallow and uneven. His chest struggled to rise, as if something was pressing from the inside. His blood pressure dropped quickly, and his skin turned cold and pale. The doctors tried medications, oxygen, and rapid checks, but nothing worked the way it should have. Every second felt heavier than the last. The nurse saw exactly what was happening. She stepped forward without hesitation. This time, her voice was firm, clear, and impossible to ignore. She named the problem directly and explained what was causing the commander's sudden collapse. She pointed to the exact area that needed attention and explained what needed to be done immediately to save his life. The room went silent. There was no anger in her voice, no panic, just calm certainty, the kind that comes from experience, not theory. The doctors looked at her, truly looking this time. What she was saying made sense. It explained everything they were seeing but could not understand. For a brief moment, the lead doctor hesitated. Admitting he might be wrong was not easy. But the commander's condition was getting worse by the second. There was no time for pride. "Do it," the lead doctor finally said. The team moved fast. They followed the nurse's instructions exactly. Equipment was repositioned, pressure was released, and the focus shifted to the real problem. The nurse stayed close, guiding the steps with short, clear directions. She knew how quickly things could go wrong, and she did not allow confusion. Slowly, the chaos began to settle. The commander's breathing eased just a little. The numbers on the monitors stopped falling. Then, one by one, they started to improve. The loud alarms softened into steady beeps again. It wasn't over, but the danger had been stopped. A heavy silence filled the room. The doctors exchanged looks of disbelief. What they had missed, the new nurse had seen clearly. And not by luck, by knowledge. The lead doctor looked at her with a different expression now. There was no doubt left in his eyes. Only respect, mixed with shock. He asked her how she knew. She answered simply. She said she had seen this kind of injury before many times. She didn't explain where or how. She didn't need to. The results spoke for her. The commander remained unconscious, but his body was no longer failing. The immediate danger had passed. The team prepared him for the next stage of treatment, this time carefully checking every detail the nurse pointed out. No one laughed anymore. The nurse stepped back again, returning to her quiet place near the wall. She did not celebrate or demand recognition. Saving a life was not about praise. It was about doing what was right, even when no one believed you. One of the younger doctors looked at her with open admiration. Another nodded silently. The lead doctor took a deep breath, knowing how close they had come to losing the commander. The room that once felt full of ego now felt humble. Outside, the night continued as normal, unaware of what had just happened inside. But inside that room, everything had changed. The nurse was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a new nurse. She was the reason a SEAL commander was still alive. And though no one said it out loud yet, everyone in that room understood one simple truth. They had judged her too quickly, and they had almost paid the price for it. After the danger passed, the emergency room felt very different. The loud alarms were gone, replaced by slow, steady beeping from the machines. The Navy SEAL commander lay quietly on the bed, breathing more evenly now. His face still showed pain, but the fight inside his body had calmed. The crisis was over, at least for the moment. The doctors stood around the bed, catching their breath. No one spoke right away. Each of them knew how close they had come to losing him. The confidence they had earlier was replaced by deep thought. Their eyes moved again and again toward the nurse standing nearby. This time, they did not look at her with doubt. The lead doctor broke the silence. His voice was quieter than before. He asked the nurse to explain again what she had seen and why she acted so quickly. There was no command in his tone now. It was a request. The nurse stepped forward. She explained everything in simple, clear words. She talked about how the commander's symptoms did not match the surface injuries. She explained how certain battlefield injuries could hide inside the body and become deadly if not treated fast. Her words were confident but not proud. She spoke like someone who had learned these lessons the hard way. The doctors listened carefully. They did not interrupt her. Some nodded slowly as they began to understand where they had gone wrong. Others looked down, realizing they had ignored important signs because of their own assumptions. One doctor asked her where she learned to recognize such rare problems. She paused for a moment, then answered calmly that she had worked in high-risk environments before. She did not give details. She did not need to. The room already knew she was not ordinary. From that moment on, the way they treated her changed completely. As the commander was prepared for further care, the doctors asked the nurse for her opinion at every step. They checked the monitors together, discussed test results, and listened when she pointed out small changes. The teamwork felt natural, as if it should have been this way from the start. The nurse moved with quiet confidence. She adjusted equipment, checked the commander's vitals, and stayed alert. Her focus never left the patient. Even though she had earned respect, she did not act differently. Her goal was not to prove anything. It was to protect the man lying in front of her. The younger medical staff noticed the change. Nurses and interns who had earlier stayed silent now watched closely. They saw how quickly respect could shift when skill was revealed. They learned a lesson that night without anyone having to teach it. The lead doctor stepped aside with one of his colleagues and spoke in a low voice. He admitted that he had judged the nurse too quickly. He said experience did not always come with titles or loud voices. His colleague agreed, still shaking his head in disbelief. As the hours passed, the commander's condition remained stable. The fear that had filled the room earlier slowly faded. The staff allowed themselves to breathe again. They knew the hardest part was over. The nurse stood by the bed one last time, checking the commander's pulse and breathing. For a brief moment, she looked at his face with something deeper than professional concern. There was recognition there, though she kept it hidden. She had seen men like him before, strong leaders who carried the weight of others on their shoulders. She then stepped back and returned to her place, just as she had at the beginning of the night. But now, no one saw her as the new nurse. The doctors spoke to her with respect. They trusted her judgment. And even without knowing her full story, they understood one important truth. She had saved a life when others could not. The room was calm again, but the lesson would stay with them forever. Skill does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it stands quietly in the corner, waiting for the moment when it is needed most. Time moved slowly as the night continued. The emergency room lights stayed bright, but the tension had softened. The Navy SEAL commander remained unconscious, yet his breathing was steady and strong. The machines around him showed stable numbers, and that alone felt like a victory. Doctors and nurses moved more calmly now, careful but no longer rushed. The nurse stayed close, checking his condition again and again. She noticed every small change, every movement of his chest, every shift in his heartbeat. Even though others trusted her now, she trusted only careful observation. Experience had taught her that danger could return without warning. After several hours, something changed. The commander's fingers twitched slightly. His breathing deepened, and his eyelids moved as if he were waking from a deep sleep. The nurse noticed first. She leaned closer, watching his face carefully. She gently spoke his name, her voice calm and steady. Slowly, his eyes opened. At first, his gaze was unfocused. Pain and confusion showed on his face as he tried to understand where he was. He took a slow breath and blinked against the bright lights. The nurse stayed close, explaining softly that he was safe and in the hospital. The commander's eyes moved around the room. He took in the doctors, the machines, the unfamiliar faces. Then his gaze stopped. He saw the nurse. Something changed in his expression. Confusion turned into recognition. His eyes sharpened, and his face grew serious. Even in his weakened state, he tried to lift his head slightly. The nurse froze for a moment. She knew that look. She had seen it before long ago in a very different place. With visible effort, the commander raised his right hand. His movement was slow and painful, but it was clear and deliberate. He brought his hand to his forehead and gave a formal military salute. The room went completely silent. Doctors and nurses stood frozen, unsure of what they were seeing. This was not normal. A high-ranking SEAL commander did not salute hospital staff, especially not a nurse, especially not one they had laughed at earlier. The nurse stood straight. For a brief second, her calm face softened. Then she returned the salute, just as formally, just as respectfully. Her movement was perfect, practiced, and full of meaning. No one in the room spoke. The commander lowered his hand slowly, exhaustion washing over him. His eyes never left the nurse. With great effort, he spoke in a weak but clear voice. He said her name. The doctors exchanged shocked looks. How did he know her name? The commander explained, slowly and with pauses for breath. Years ago, during a dangerous mission, his unit had been trapped under heavy fire. Men were injured, and chaos was everywhere. In that moment, she had been there not as a hospital nurse but as a battlefield medical officer. She had treated the wounded under fire and saved lives while bullets flew around them. She had saved his life once before. The room felt heavy with realization. The doctors finally understood why she had recognized the hidden injury so quickly. Why she had spoken with such certainty. Why she had remained calm while others panicked. This was not theory learned from books. This was experience earned in war. The nurse did not interrupt him. She did not add details. She did not seek attention. She simply stood there, letting the truth speak for itself. The commander closed his eyes again, exhausted but safe. His breathing stayed steady. The salute had taken all his strength, but he had needed to do it. The doctors stood in silence, humbled. Every assumption they had made about the nurse shattered in that moment. She was not just a nurse. She was a warrior who saved lives in places most of them had never seen. And they had laughed at her. The silence in the room lasted long after the commander closed his eyes again. No one rushed to speak. No one made a joke. The doctors and nurses stood still, their minds trying to accept what they had just witnessed. The salute, the recognition, the story, it had changed everything. One of the senior doctors finally cleared his throat. His face looked tense, not from stress, but from embarrassment. He asked the nurse, in a quiet voice, if what the commander said was true. His question was not doubting anymore. It was careful, almost respectful. The nurse nodded once. She did not explain right away. She walked back to the commander's side and checked his breathing and pulse, making sure he was comfortable. Only after she was satisfied did she turn back to the room. Her movements were calm, controlled, and professional. She spoke simply. She said that before working in the hospital, she had served as a combat medical officer attached to special operations units. Her job had been to treat wounded soldiers in the middle of missions, often under fire, with limited equipment and no second chances. She explained that after years of service, she chose to step into a quieter role. The room listened closely. She explained that she did not want attention or special treatment. She had asked for a low-profile assignment. To her, saving lives did not require rank or recognition. It only required skill, focus, and responsibility. The doctors exchanged glances. Everything now made sense. The calm confidence, the sharp observations, the way she acted without fear or hesitation. They realized that her experience went far beyond anything written on her badge. One doctor spoke up, his voice full of regret. He admitted that they had judged her based on appearance and title. He said they should have listened sooner. The words were honest and heavy. The nurse accepted the apology with a small nod. She did not smile or show pride. She said mistakes happen when people stop listening. What mattered was learning from them. The lead doctor stepped forward. He apologized openly in front of everyone. He said his pride almost cost a man his life. It was not easy for him to say, but he said it anyway. That moment changed the atmosphere completely. The nurse was no longer just respected. She was trusted. From that point on, every decision involving the commander included her input. The doctors asked her to stay involved in his recovery. They adjusted treatment plans based on her battlefield knowledge. They understood that modern medicine and combat experience together could save lives. As news quietly spread through the hospital, staff members became curious. People whispered about the nurse who had been saluted by a SEAL commander. But when they looked at her, they saw nothing dramatic. Just a woman doing her job, focused and calm. The nurse avoided attention. She stayed close to the patient, checking his condition, adjusting care, and speaking softly when needed. She treated the commander with the same respect she gave every patient. Later that night, one of the younger nurses approached her. With nervous honesty, she said the nurse had inspired her. She said she learned that night that true strength does not need to be loud. The nurse thanked her quietly and returned to her work. The doctors, meanwhile, reflected on what had happened. They realized how dangerous assumptions could be. They had believed skill came only with titles, age, and authority. That belief nearly cost them a life. Now they knew better. The commander slept peacefully, his condition stable. His body was healing because someone had spoken up when others refused to listen. The nurse stood by the window for a brief moment, looking out into the dark night. Her face showed calm, but her eyes held many memories. She had survived war, loss, and pressure beyond imagination. A hospital was quieter, but the responsibility felt the same. Saving lives was still her mission, and now everyone around her understood that truth. The silence in the room stayed heavy even after the commander drifted back into sleep. No one moved for a few moments. The doctors were still processing what they had just heard and seen. The salute had not only surprised them, it had shaken their pride and their assumptions. One of the senior doctors finally spoke, his voice low and careful. He asked the nurse if the commander's words were true. This time, there was no doubt or challenge in his tone. He genuinely wanted to understand. The nurse gave a small nod. She did not rush to explain herself. First, she checked the commander again, adjusting his blanket and making sure his breathing was steady. Only then did she turn back toward the group. She spoke in simple words. She said that before joining the hospital, she had worked as a combat medical officer with special operations units. Her role was to treat injured soldiers during missions, often in dangerous situations where mistakes meant death. She explained that she had been trained to make fast decisions under pressure and to notice small signs others might miss. The room listened closely. No one interrupted. She added that after years of service, she chose to step away from active combat. She wanted to continue saving lives, but in a quieter way. That was why she had taken a basic nursing role and asked not to be treated differently. Titles had never mattered to her. Only the work did. The doctors exchanged slow, understanding looks. Everything now made sense. Her calm behavior, her sharp judgment, her confidence when everyone else panicked. It all came from real experience, not from textbooks. One doctor spoke with clear regret. He admitted they had laughed at her and ignored her warnings because they judged her by her uniform and position. He said they almost lost a hero because of that mistake. The nurse listened without anger. She said people make mistakes when stress and ego take control. What mattered most was learning and doing better next time. Then the lead doctor stepped forward. He apologized openly in front of the entire team. He admitted his pride had blinded him. The words were hard for him to say, but he said them anyway. The room felt lighter after that, as if honesty had lifted a heavy weight. From that moment, the nurse was fully accepted as part of the team. The doctors asked her to remain involved in the commander's care. They valued her opinion and respected her judgment. Decisions were discussed, not ordered. The teamwork felt stronger than before. As quiet news spread through the hospital, staff members became curious about the nurse who had been saluted by a SEAL commander. But when they saw her, she was just doing her job, checking vitals, adjusting equipment, and speaking gently to patients. Later, a young nurse approached her and said the night had changed how she saw leadership. She said strength did not always come with loud voices or high rank. The nurse thanked her softly and returned to her duties. The commander rested peacefully, alive because someone had the courage to speak when others refused to listen. The doctors would never forget that lesson. Morning light slowly entered the hospital through the tall windows. The long night was finally over. The machines around the Navy SEAL commander continued their calm, steady beeping. He was still weak, but he was alive, stable, and safe. For everyone in that room, that alone felt like a victory. The doctors returned for morning rounds with a different mindset than the night before. There was no rush, no arrogance, and no careless confidence. Every movement was thoughtful. Every decision was discussed. They checked the commander carefully, following the plan created together with the nurse who had saved his life. When the commander woke again, he was clearer this time. His eyes opened slowly, and he looked around the room. He saw the doctors, the equipment, and then he saw her. The nurse stood near the bed, reviewing his vitals quietly. He gave a small, tired smile. He did not try to salute this time. His body was too weak, but the respect in his eyes was still there. He thanked her softly, his voice low but sincere. He said that once again, she had brought him back from the edge. She nodded and told him to rest. Healing was the next mission now. As the day continued, the commander was moved to a recovery room. Word of what had happened did not spread loudly, but it spread enough. The staff treated the nurse differently now, not with fear or exaggeration, but with real respect. They listened when she spoke. They valued her opinion, yet she did not change. She still wore the same simple uniform. She still spoke calmly. She still stood quietly when not needed. Her actions remained steady and professional. Praise did not interest her. Recognition did not motivate her. Saving lives did. The doctors reflected on the night again and again. They realized how close they had come to making a fatal mistake. They understood that experience does not always come with visible signs. Sometimes, the most skilled person in the room is the quietest one. The lead doctor gathered his team later that day. He spoke honestly about what had happened. He said that listening mattered more than rank. He reminded them that medicine was about teamwork, not ego. The lesson was painful, but it was necessary. The nurse continued her work, helping other patients, checking charts, and offering support. To most patients, she was just another kind face in a busy hospital. They did not know her story, and she preferred it that way. Before leaving for the day, she visited the commander once more. He was resting comfortably, his color better than before. She adjusted his blanket and checked his pulse. For a brief moment, she allowed herself a small smile. The mission was complete. As she walked down the hallway, the hospital felt quiet and peaceful. Another life had been saved. Another lesson had been learned. This story did not end with applause or awards. It ended with something more important: understanding. The doctors learned that judging people too quickly can be dangerous. The staff learned that true strength is often silent. And the commander lived because someone spoke up when others refused to listen. In the end, the nurse did not need a title to earn respect. She earned it by saving a life.